The marble floors of Maison Alera were the kind of white that made you afraid to breathe too hard. Alna Mills had walked into plenty of beautiful rooms in her life. She had written about them: the light inside a Kyoto temple at noon, the hush of a Parisian gallery before the crowds arrived, the smell of old wood in a Lagos library that hadn't changed since her grandmother was young. She knew how to move through beauty without disturbing it. She had always believed that if you carried yourself with enough quiet dignity, a room would eventually decide to let you belong. She was wrong today. She stood near the center of the boutique, her sleeveless yellow floral dress catching the chandelier light in a way that should have felt joyful. Her wide-brimmed cream hat sat perfectly on her head. Her structured tan handbag rested in both hands, held just in front of her like a small shield she hadn't realized she was carrying. She hadn't come to cause a scene. She had come to buy something beautiful for the woman who would become her future mother-in-law. One quiet afternoon. One ordinary errand. No escorts. No names dropped. Just Alna by herself moving through the world the way she always had, gracefully without announcement. The manager's name was Vivian. She wore a crimson suit so sharply tailored it looked like a weapon someone had decided to wear instead of carry. Her dark hair was pinned into a low, severe bun. Her posture was the posture of someone who had spent years deciding who deserved to touch things in this room. She had been watching Alna from the moment she walked in. Not the way a sales associate watches a customer. The way a gatekeeper watches a trespasser. Alna had felt it. The way the nearest staff member drifted just slightly away when she moved toward a silk evening rack. The way the junior associate had suggested with a smile too practiced to be kind, that the clearance selection near the back was quite lovely this season. Alna had said nothing. She had simply moved forward softly, with the kind of composure she had learned to wear like armor in rooms that weren't built to receive her. Then Vivian moved. She stepped directly into Alna's path, one hand rising in a flat, deliberate stop gesture. Palm out, fingers together. The way you signal a car that does not have the right of way. "I'm sorry." Her voice was not sorry. It was polished and final, the tone of someone who had made this decision long before Alna arrived. Some of our pieces in this section are reserved for appointment clients. Perhaps I can direct you somewhere more suitable. The boutique went quiet in the particular way expensive rooms go quiet when they sense a performance is beginning. A woman in a pale blue blazer stopped pretending to examine a handbag. Two others near the fitting rooms turned their heads. A sales associate near the register suddenly found something important to stare at on her screen. Alna's breath caught. She felt her expression hold, barely, while something inside her dropped away like a stone through still water. She had been writing about the world for 8 years. She had interviewed senators and artists and fishermen and grieving mothers. She knew cruelty in its formal clothes. She recognized exactly what this was. "I don't need an appointment," she said, her voice quiet and level. "I'm just shopping." Vivian's smile thinned. She took one step closer. "Of course. But as I said." She said she's shopping. The voice came from behind her. It was low. It was not loud. But it arrived in the room the way thunder arrives before anyone expected a storm. Not as sound but as a shift in the air itself. Every chandelier crystal seemed to catch the same light at once. Alna turned. The glass doors at the boutique's entrance were still swinging open, but they were the only things still moving. Outside, on the other side of the wide mall corridor, the main security shutters had begun their slow mechanical descent, panels of steel rolling down over storefronts one by one, like eyelids closing across a face that had seen enough. Han Sung-ho walked in like he owned the floor he was standing on, because there was a very real chance that he did. He wore a black three-piece suit with an open collar, and the dark ink of his neck and chest tattoos rose above the fabric like a warning printed in a language Vivian had never needed to learn, until right now. His shoulders were squared. His jaw was set. His eyes moved first to Alna, and for exactly 2 seconds, something in his face broke open. Quiet, private, the kind of tenderness that only exists in men who are terrifying everywhere else. He saw what had been done to her. He understood it completely. Then his gaze moved to Vivian and the tenderness was gone. Behind him, two men in black suits stepped into position on either side of the entrance and held the descending shutter up with their hands, not straining, just there. Patient. Like men who had done this before and would do it again and felt nothing about it either way. The boutique was no longer a boutique. It was a room with no exits and a very angry man standing in the only door. Now, before we go any further into what happened next, go ahead and subscribe or leave a comment below telling me, what would you have done in Elna's place? Would you have walked out quietly or waited for the storm? It truly means a lot to see our community growing right here. Every comment, every share, every subscriber helps us bring these stories to more people who deserve to feel seen, and I am so grateful that we get to do that together. Elna Mills had a rule she had kept since her first assignment at 23, when her editor had handed her a press pass for a resort in Bali and told her to write something that makes people feel homesick for a place they've never been. The rule was simple: leave the labels at home. Not because she couldn't afford them, she had been able to afford them for some years now, in the quiet way of a woman who had built something real without anyone watching. But because the moment you wear your price tag on the outside, people stop looking at what's underneath. And Elna was, at her core, someone who needed people to look at what was underneath. It was the only way she knew how to write honestly about the world. She had grown up in Accra, the second daughter of a literature professor and a seamstress who had a gift for making beautiful things out of very little. Her mother could look at a woman and know her measurements without asking. She could hold fabric up to the light and tell you what story it wanted to tell. Elna had inherited that quality. Not for cloth but for rooms, for cities, for the specific texture of a place at a particular hour of day. She noticed things. He always had. The way a cafe in Istanbul smelled differently at 8 in the morning than at 3 in the afternoon. The way the light in Seoul in October had a quality that felt almost editorial, like the city was composing itself for a photograph no one was taking yet. She wrote about these things for a magazine with a quiet but devoted following, and occasionally for a newspaper that paid her more but asked for less of what she actually thought. She was good at her work. She was proud of it without performing the pride. Her style on the road was deliberate. She packed light always. She wore things that traveled well: structured linen, clean silhouettes, fabrics that held their shape across time zones. She owned one good watch, gifted to herself on her 30th birthday, with no logo visible from a distance. Her handbags were quality without spectacle. Her jewelry was minimal. When she entered a room, people noticed her without quite knowing why. Her posture had something to do with it, and the way her eyes moved, taking everything in without looking hungry for any of it. She did not perform wealth, but she also did not apologize for having earned some. She had simply decided long ago that real elegance was the kind that required no audience. She had been in this city, Han Sung-ho's city. She had started calling it privately with a mixture of warmth and unease, for 4 days before the afternoon that would change things. She was here because the engagement dinner was in 2 days, and Sung-ho's family required a full week of what his personal assistant described, in the calendar invitation, as ceremonial preparation. Elna had smiled when she read that. She had also felt, somewhere behind her sternum, the quiet flutter of something she could not entirely name. Not fear exactly. Something closer to the feeling you get when you are standing at the edge of a very beautiful cliff, looking down, knowing the water below is cold and that you have already decided to jump. She had asked for one afternoon alone. Just one. Before the dinners and the introductions and the careful navigation of a world that ran on rules she was still learning. One afternoon to be herself entirely, without the weight of becoming someone's fiancé in a room full of people who had opinions about what that meant. She wanted to find a gift for Sung-ho's mother. Something tasteful, something that said I see you and I respect you without saying I'm trying too hard. She had a sense for these things. She trusted her instincts. She had put on her yellow floral dress that morning because it made her feel like herself, the version of herself that existed before any of this. Light, free, curious, unhurried. She had set her cream sun hat on her head at a slight angle, picked up her tan handbag, and stepped out into the city with the particular ease of a woman who has been navigating unfamiliar places alone for most of her adult life. She had not called for a driver. She had not told Sung-ho where she was going. She had wanted, more than anything, To simply disappear into an ordinary afternoon. To be a woman shopping in a beautiful city without context, without protection, without the invisible architecture of another person's name rearranging the room around her. That was the choice that would cost her something. And that was also the choice that would eventually show her exactly who she was. In certain circles of Seoul's financial and criminal landscape, circles that overlapped more than anyone in either world liked to admit, Han Sung-ho was discussed in the way you discuss weather. Not as a person but as a condition. Something you planned around. Something you did not argue with. He was 36 years old and had inherited leadership of his organization at 28 under circumstances that were still debated in quiet rooms by people who had known his father. He had not inherited it the way a son inherits a business. He had taken it the way a surgeon takes a scalpel. With precision, with full knowledge of what he was about to cut, and without the luxury of hesitation. Those who had expected him to be grateful or pliable had revised their assessment quickly. Those who had expected him to be reckless had revised it even faster. Sung-ho was neither. He was disciplined in a way that frightened people more than anger ever could, because discipline does not make mistakes. He controlled import and export operations through 3 shell corporations and 2 subsidiaries that an accounting firm in Zurich had been carefully constructing for 11 years. He had interests in logistics, in private security, in a hotel group with properties across 4 Asian cities. He sat on the boards of 2 legitimate foundations and attended charity events with the ease of a man who had learned early that visibility, correctly managed, is its own form of protection. He was photographed occasionally at these events. Always composed, always correct, always wearing something that cost more than most people's monthly rent without looking like it was trying to. People who met him in professional contexts often said afterward that he seemed almost ordinary. That he was polite. That he listened carefully when you spoke. That he asked good questions. What they were picking up without fully understanding it was the quality of his attention. The way he absorbed information, the way still water absorbs everything that falls into it, holding it all, giving nothing back until he decided to. He did not waste energy. He did not perform authority. He simply existed in rooms as though the rooms had been built around him, which in several cases they literally had. His tenderness was a secret he kept badly only around Elna. His lieutenant, a lean and careful man named Park Jiseok who had known him for 12 years, had once described it to his wife this way. You know how he looks at a problem? Like he is already 4 steps past it, already thinking about what comes after the solution. When he looks at her like she is the solution. Like everything before her was the problem. His wife had said that was the most romantic thing Jiseok had ever said, and Jiseok had been slightly embarrassed about it for a week. It was true though. Something in Sung-ho became still around Elna in a different way than his usual stillness. His usual stillness was control. What happened around her was closer to rest. He had not known before her that those were different things. They had met at an exhibition. Not a gala. Not a curated business dinner, not one of the networking events that populated his calendar like obligations dressed as opportunities. An actual exhibition. A small photography show in a converted warehouse space in Hongdae, mounted by a collective of young documentary photographers who had spent 3 years working across Southeast Asia. Sung-ho had gone because one of the photographers was the younger brother of a man he owed a quiet favor to, and because he had found in the past few years that art was one of the few environments in which he could be anonymous. People in art spaces were looking at the walls. They were not generally looking at him. He had arrived 30 minutes after the opening, which meant the initial crowd noise had settled and the serious attendees remained. The ones who were actually reading the captions, actually standing in front of images long enough to feel something. He had been doing exactly that, standing in front of a large print of a woman in a fishing village in Vietnam, her back to the camera, looking out at a horizon that suggested everything and explained nothing, when he became aware that someone had positioned themselves next to him and had been standing there, reading the same image for almost 4 minutes without speaking. He turned slightly and saw Elna Mills for the first time. She was wearing a pale olive dress and small gold earrings, and she was holding a glass of wine that she had clearly forgotten she was holding because she had not taken a single sip. Her face was tilted slightly upward toward the photograph, and her expression was the expression of someone receiving information. Not casual absorption but something more active, more like the face of a person translating. Her eyes moved slowly across the image. She was not performing appreciation. She was doing something with what she saw. Sung-ho had been around women who understood art as decoration and women who understood it as currency and women who performed sensitivity like a second outfit. He had not often been around a woman who looked at a photograph the way a writer looks at a sentence, trying to understand what it was trying to say and whether it succeeded. He said almost involuntarily, "She's waiting for someone." Alna blinked as though returning from somewhere and looked at him. Her expression registered his presence without alarm, without the particular recalibration that people often did around him when they felt something was off but couldn't locate the source. She simply looked at him the way you look at someone who has said an interesting thing and you want to decide whether they mean it. "I thought she was looking for something she lost," she said. "She's leaning forward. Waiting is more passive than that." He considered this. Both can be true. They can, she agreed. She took a sip of the wine. "You came to the opening alone." "So did you." "I came to write about it." She said it simply, not as explanation or defense. Just information. "I like to see things before I decide what I think about them. Most people decide first." "I know." She looked back at the photograph. "That's why most writing about places and things feels like reading someone else's opinion of someone else's opinion. Nothing original at the bottom of it." She paused. "I'm Elna. Sung-ho." He did not offer a last name. He almost never did in first meetings, not because he was being coy but because he had learned that his last name tended to change the conversation before it had properly started. She did not press for it. She also did not seem particularly moved by his first name, or by him, in the way that suggested she was managing being moved. She was simply present. He found this extraordinary. They spent the next hour moving through the exhibition together without having agreed to do so. She had things to say about most of the photographs. Not lectures but observations, the kind of quick lateral thinking that came from years of professional looking. She noticed details he had missed and said so plainly, without the false modesty of someone waiting to be praised for the noticing. He asked her questions. She answered them directly. She asked him questions too. "What do you do? What brought you here tonight? Do you come to things like this often?" And he answered as honestly as he could within the limits of what could be said in a first conversation with a stranger in a well-lit public room. When the exhibition was closing and the lights shifted to signal the end of the evening, they had walked toward the exit together and he had held the door and she had stepped through it and then turned on the pavement outside and said, "It was a good show. I'll write something honest about it. Can I read it when it's published?" She had looked at him for a moment. "Give me your email," she said, and she was already pulling out her phone with the matter-of-factness of a woman who had decided something. He gave her his personal address. Not the public one, not the one his assistant managed. She entered it, slid the phone back into her bag, said goodnight, and walked away into the October evening without looking back. He had stood on the pavement for slightly longer than was necessary, watching the direction she had gone. Park Jiseok, who had been stationed at a respectful distance all evening and who had now materialized at his side, said nothing. He had known his employer long enough to recognize the difference between the silences. The article ran 3 weeks later and it was exactly what she had said it would be. Honest. She had written about the exhibition with the clarity of someone who cared about what photography could do when it stopped trying to be beautiful and started trying to be true. She had mentioned nothing personal, nothing about encounters at openings, nothing that was not about the work itself. She had written a sentence near the end that Sung-ho had read 4 times on the morning he received the email with the link. The most affecting images here are the ones where the photographer seems to have stopped looking for a composition and started simply witnessing. There is a difference and you can feel it. Witnessing requires trust. In the moment, in the subject, in the possibility that what is real is enough. He had written back 3 words, "It was enough." She had replied 6 hours later. "You read it carefully." "I read everything carefully," he had written. "So do I," she had said. "Coffee sometime?" That was how it had begun. Coffee, which became dinner, which became long conversations in quiet restaurants where he had the kind of privacy that money and reputation purchase without needing to be requested. He had not told her the full scope of what he was for several months, not because he was ashamed of it. Shame had never been something he had much patience for as an emotion, but because he had wanted for as long as possible to be known as something other than what he was. To be known as someone who asked good questions and read carefully and became, in her presence, unexpectedly unhurried. When she had found out, through the kind of accidental collision with reality that happens in a city where people talk, she had not screamed. She had not cried. She had sat across from him at the table where he had finally told her the rest of it, and she had been quiet for a long time, and then she had said, "I need to think." She had taken 2 weeks. He had not pushed. He came back. She had looked at him across a table in a tea house she had chosen because she wanted neutral ground and told him, "I'm not in love with your world. I want to be clear about that. I am in love with you inside it, which is a different thing. I need you to understand the difference." He had understood perfectly. It was, he thought, the most precisely drawn love confession he had ever received, and it was entirely like her. The engagement had happened in the spring on a quiet evening with no audience. No elaborate production. No restaurant full of waiting staff with champagne flutes and coordinated timing. Sung-ho had arranged none of those things, because he had been paying attention for long enough to know that Elna would have found them excruciating. Instead, he had taken her to a small botanical garden he had arranged to have opened privately for the evening. Not a dramatic gesture but a quiet one, the kind that required more thought than money. He had chosen it because she had mentioned months earlier in passing that she found it harder and harder to see stars in cities and that she missed the way the sky had looked from her grandmother's courtyard when she was a child. They had walked through the garden in the early dark, and at some point he had stopped and turned to her and said without any particular preamble, "I want you beside me for the rest of my life. I want to ask whether you want the same thing." She had looked at him. The particular quality of her gaze in that moment, direct, serious, slightly lit from within, was something he had filed away in the part of his memory he did not share with anyone. "Yes," she had said. Simply. Completely. The way she said most important things. He had produced a ring that she had helped design without knowing she was designing it. He had asked her months earlier to describe the kind of jewelry she found most beautiful in the abstract, and he had remembered every word. She had looked at it in the low garden light and laughed softly, a genuine sound, a surprised one, and he had felt something inside his chest that he had no adequate language for. The family dinner was in 2 days. His mother, his 2 aunts, his oldest uncle, and a carefully selected collection of people who represented the domestic architecture of his life. People whose approval was not required but whose presence at the table would signal, to everyone who needed to know it, that this was real and permanent and not a thing to be tested. Elna understood the weight of it. She had been graceful about the preparation, about the briefings, about the quiet strategic decisions that attended a formal introduction into a family like his. But on the morning of the day before the dinner, she had stood at the window of their suite looking out at the city and said, "I need one afternoon. Just mine. No car, no jizyak, no itinerary. I want to walk around and be a person for a few hours." He had looked at her for a moment. Every instinct that had kept him alive and effective for over a decade sent a faint signal. The city was not dangerous for her, not openly, but there were dynamics he was aware of that she was not. And the days surrounding the family dinner were not the days he would have chosen for her to move through the world alone. But he also knew, with the same precision with which he knew most important things, that saying no to this would cost him something he did not want to pay. She was not asking for permission. She was telling him what she needed, which was different, and she was trusting him to hear the difference. "Be back by 7, he said. She had kissed him once, quickly like a punctuation mark, and picked up her bag. Maison Hilaire was not the first boutique she had passed that afternoon. She had already spent 40 minutes in a beautiful stationery and home fragrance shop, where she had bought a handmade book of pressed botanicals that she thought might interest Sung-ho's mother, who she had been told appreciated things made with patience. She had sat for 20 minutes at a cafe and written a page of notes in her journal. Observations about the city, textures she wanted to remember, the specific quality of the light at this hour in this season. She had felt walking through the afternoon like herself. The version of herself that moved through the world without requiring anything from it. She had seen the boutique from the street and paused. It was beautiful in the severe, pristine way of places that understand they are selling something beyond the objects on the racks. The marble facade, the tall glass doors, the sparse window display that used negative space to communicate expense. She had written about rooms like this before. A Paris atelier, a Milan boutique on a side street with no signage, a small jeweler in Tokyo that required a referral to enter. She was not intimidated by them. She found them interesting the way she found most human performances interesting. She thought of Sung-ho's mother. A woman who, by all accounts, had impeccable taste and very specific opinions. A woman who was not cruel but who was exacting, which could feel like the same thing in certain moments. Alna wanted to find something that communicated respect without flattery. She had already found one gift. She could afford to look for something additional, something lighter. A scarf perhaps, or a small object of domestic elegance. She adjusted her hat, shifted her bag to both hands and pushed through the glass doors. The interior was everything the facade had promised. White walls, gold fixtures, clothing hung at intervals that made each piece feel singular and deliberate. Crystal chandeliers at regular intervals cast a warm but high-contrast light that made the room feel watched even when no one was explicitly watching. The floor was polished to a reflectiveness that made Alna briefly see herself as she walked in. Yellow dress, cream hat, structured bag. A woman who looked at ease in beautiful places because she genuinely was. A junior associate near the entrance smiled in her direction, but it was the smile of someone assessing rather than welcoming. The corners calibrated, the eyes traveling down and back up in a movement too practiced to be casual. Alna noted it the way she noted everything. Filed, not dismissed. She moved toward the center of the floor and began to browse. There was a wall of silk scarves near the back that caught her eye, and she walked toward it slowly, looking at the other pieces as she passed. A structured jacket in cream and black. A long evening skirt in deep burgundy. A glass case of small leather accessories. Card holders, keyrings, a compact mirror in brushed gold. She paused at the accessories case, looking at a slim card case in ivory that seemed the right kind of quiet luxury. She was aware of the staff. The junior associate from the entrance had drifted, subtly, to a position approximately 10 feet behind her. She had not been offered assistance, not been greeted by name, not been told about any current collections or special pieces. When she had passed a different associate while moving toward the scarf wall, the woman had looked down at something on a tablet and not looked up. Alna had been in this business long enough, and in enough beautiful rooms with enough invisible hierarchies, to know what being made invisible felt like. She knew when a room was deciding something about her. She kept her expression neutral and her pace unhurried. She was not going to give anyone here the satisfaction of seeing her adjust. She reached the scarf wall and began to look properly, touching the edge of a silk panel in deep teal. The quality was extraordinary, she noticed, the kind of hand that only came from a very particular weave, and she was thinking about whether Sung-ho's mother had preferences about color when she became aware that someone had come to stand directly beside her. Not a collie close beside, but the kind of close that is itself a message. She turned. Vivian was already speaking. "These pieces are part of our private client selection," she said, and the sentence was shaped to sound informational but landed like a hand placed firmly on a door. "They're not on the general floor." "The rack is on the general floor," Alna said mildly, gesturing to where the scarves were displayed. "The display is," Vivian said. "The purchasing process for this collection is not. I'd be happy to direct you to our ready-to-purchase range." She paused. The pause was its own kind of contempt. The measured silence of someone giving you just enough time to understand your place. It's better suited to walk-in customers. The room had gone quiet by then, in the particular way of a room in which everyone is pretending not to listen. Alna felt the eyes without turning to find them. She felt the weight of the watchers, the waiting, the almost imperceptible tilt of the environment away from her, the way a room full of people comfortable with a particular order will, without speaking, communicate to the person who disrupts that order that they are alone here. Her heartbeat was even. Her hands were still. She held the edge of the teal silk a moment longer, letting herself feel the quality of it, because she refused to let this woman's performance make her afraid of a piece of fabric. Then she set it down carefully, the way she set everything down, with attention and intention, and turned fully to face the woman in the crimson suit. She did not yet know that outside, moving through the mall concourse with 12 men and the controlled fury of someone who had been made aware just minutes ago of exactly what was happening inside this room, Han Sung-ho was already walking toward the glass doors. She did not know that his phone had received a message from a source inside the mall whose job it was to pay attention to things that required attention, and that the message had contained a description of the scene in enough detail that he had already made 3 calls, 2 quiet and 1 very direct, before his car reached the parking structure. She did not know that outside the security shutters were already descending. He only knew the room. The light. The woman in front of her with the raised hand and the managed expression and the polished certainty that she had the authority to decide who was allowed to want beautiful things. And Alna Mills, who had spent 31 years learning to move through the world gracefully, who had written honestly about beauty in 14 countries, who had once described a sunrise over the Volta River in language that made her editor call her at 7 in the morning to say, "This is why we do this." Alna Mills stood her ground without taking a single step and waited to see what the room would decide to do next. She didn't have long to wait. The chandeliers trembled. The light outside the glass doors shifted. And behind the sound of her own heartbeat, keeping its even, careful rhythm, she heard the heavy mechanical groan of something large and final lowering itself into place. Before we continue, if this story is pulling you in, go ahead and like this video or subscribe right now. Drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever walked into a room and known before a single word was spoken that someone had already decided who you were? It truly means a lot to see this community growing. Every share, every subscriber, every person who stays until the end helps us bring stories like this to the people who need to feel them, and I am so grateful that we get to do that together. Vivian did not move. That was the thing Elna noticed first. The absolute stillness of the woman, the way she held her position in front of the scarf wall like someone who had rehearsed this moment, who had stood in this exact spot in her mind before Elna had ever walked through those glass doors. There was no uncertainty in her posture. No flicker of reconsideration. She had made her calculation before the first word was spoken and she was simply executing it now, one measured sentence at a time, with the efficiency of someone who understood that cruelty, to be effective, must be administered calmly. "I'm not sure you heard me," Vivian said. Her voice had not changed. Still polished. Still precise. Still the voice of someone for whom this was not personal but procedural. "The walk-in selection is near the front of the store. I can have someone assist you there." "I heard you," Elna said. "Then I'm not sure what the confusion is." "There isn't confusion," Elna said. "I was looking at a scarf. I'd like to look at it properly." Something shifted in Vivian's expression. Not the composed surface that held, but something behind it, a tightening, the faint impression of a woman recalculating because the expected response had not materialized. Most people, Elna understood at this point, would have retreated. Would have offered an embarrassed laugh or a deflecting apology or the particular form of gracious exit that people perform when they have been publicly told they do not belong somewhere and they choose, because the alternative costs too much, to agree. Elna had done it herself before. In airport lounges and hotel lobbies and restaurants where the welcome had been just fractionally slower to arrive than it should have been. She had smiled and moved on and written it off as the cost of moving through the world in her particular skin. She had been paying that cost quietly for a long time. She was very tired of it. "I think," Vivian said, and her voice had dropped now to the register that was designed to be heard only by the two of them and somehow inevitably by every person within 20 feet, "that you might be more comfortable somewhere else. This collection has a starting price point that—" "That what?" Elna said. The sentence completed itself in the air between them without being spoken. The pause was the sentence. And it was a very specific sentence. The kind that had nothing to do with silk or price points or private client collections, and everything to do with the calculation Vivian had made the moment she saw a black woman in a sun hat and a floral dress walk through the door of a boutique that existed, in her mind, as a room for a different kind of person. Two of the women who had stopped pretending to browse had fully stopped now. One of them, in a pale gray blazer, had her phone in her hand at an angle that suggested she had been filming for longer than she wanted anyone to notice. The junior associate who had been hovering 10 feet back had taken a step closer, not to intervene. There was nothing in her posture that suggested intervention, but to watch. The room had gathered around this moment the way rooms do when they have collectively decided that someone's humiliation is entertainment. Alna felt it all. Every eye. Every held breath. The specific quality of the silence. Not uncomfortable, not conflicted, but anticipatory. They were waiting for her to break. To become loud or tearful, or to produce the reaction that would confirm the thing they had all, without discussing it, already agreed to believe. She thought of her mother. The seamstress who could hold fabric up to the light and tell you what story it wanted to tell. Who had sat across from Elna once when she was 17 and had come home from a school event with her jaw locked around something she hadn't yet found words for, and said quietly, "The world will sometimes ask you to shrink. You are not required to comply." She set her shoulders back. Just slightly. Just enough. "I would like," she said carefully, each word placed with intention, "to speak with the owner of this boutique." Vivian smiled. It was the worst kind of smile. The kind that has never touched the eyes, that exists purely as a signal of dominance. The smile of a woman who is absolutely certain she holds every card in the room. "The owner is unavailable. But I'd be happy to direct you to our online platform where—" "I don't want your online platform." Alna's voice was still quiet, still level. "I want to speak with whoever is responsible for how this store operates." "That would be me," Vivian said. "Then we have a problem." Another pause. Longer this time. Vivian's smile did not move. "Do we?" she said. She reached past Elna and removed the teal silk scarf from the rack with a deliberate proprietary gesture, the kind of gesture designed to communicate ownership so completely that it erases your claim to the space you are standing in. She held it up briefly, the way a person holds something they are deciding where to return to, and then hung it on a different section of the rack slightly farther away, as though relocating it from Elna's reach. "I think the problem is quite simple. You came into the wrong store. It happens." From somewhere behind her, near the fitting room corridor, Elna heard a low voice say, "She's been in here 20 minutes and she hasn't bought a single thing." And then another voice, quieter, almost a murmur but not quite, "That's what they do. They come in and touch everything and then—" The sentence was not finished. "Dang need to be." Elna closed her eyes for 1 second. Not because she was about to cry, she was not. But because she needed that 1 second to be completely inside herself, to find the floor of her composure and stand on it, before she opened her eyes again and decided what to do next. In that second she heard something she had not been meant to hear. A hushed exchange between Vivian and the junior associate, who had drifted close enough to receive a quiet instruction. "Did Mrs. Cha confirm it was her?" the associate whispered. "Earlier this morning." Vivian's voice was barely a breath. She said, "Make sure it's thorough." And that was all. But it was enough. 3 sentences, barely audible, delivered with the confidence of people who did not believe they were being listened to. Alma did not know that name. But she knew its weight, the specific texture of it, the way it arrived in that exchange, not as a person but as an authority. Someone who had sent a message this morning. Someone who had known Elna would be here. Someone who had used the word thorough. She opened her eyes. The room looked slightly different now. Not the room as a boutique but the room as a stage, and Elna as the scheduled performance. The humiliation she had been experiencing for the past 12 minutes had not been an accident or the casual cruelty of a status-obsessed woman making a snap judgment. It had been prepared. Someone had known she would come here alone today. Someone had made a phone call. Someone had told Vivian who she was and had used that knowledge not to extend courtesy, not to say this is Han Sung-ho's fiancé, please treat her well, but to say, this is Han Sung-ho's fiancé, make sure she knows she doesn't belong. The fear that arrived in Elna's chest was not the fear of Vivian. Vivian was a weapon. Someone had picked her up and aimed her. And what Elna felt now was the particular cold shock of realizing the attack had been personal before it was public. She thought of the engagement dinner in 2 days. She thought of the family she was about to walk into, the table she was about to sit at, the world she had agreed, with clear eyes and full knowledge, to enter beside a man she loved. She thought of how easy it had been in that world to believe the danger came from outside. That the enemies were distant and abstract. That she would be protected by proximity to him. She had not considered that someone might aim for the moments when she was not near him at all. She stood very still. Her hands were holding her bag with the same steadiness they had maintained throughout this entire scene, and she was proud of those hands, in a detached and slightly absurd way, for not shaking. Then the world changed. It did not happen dramatically. It did not happen with warning. The light outside the boutique's glass front shifted first. Not dimmed but interrupted, the way light changes when something large moves across it. Then came the sound. A mechanical, heavy, descending groan from somewhere above and outside, the sound of infrastructure obeying instructions, and then the flat, ringing clang of steel meeting marble as the first security shutter dropped completely into place across a storefront 3 units down. A woman somewhere in the boutique said something sharp and startled. The junior associate moved to the window. Through the glass, Elna watched the mall corridor begin to change. Shoppers who had been moving in the ordinary drift of an afternoon, bags in hand, phones out, unhurried, had stopped. Some were looking upward. Some were looking toward the corridor exits, where men in black suits had taken positions that were too deliberate and too still to be security staff. They were not in the uniforms of mall security. They wore the kind of black that costs money and tailored in the kind of silhouette that suggested they had been dressed for exactly this. Dark glasses. No visible emotion. The posture of men who had been told where to stand and what to do if anyone tried to leave, and who had not needed additional instructions. 2 shutters dropped in the time it took Elna to process what she was seeing. Then 3. The sound of them was architectural. The sound of a building rearranging itself. Inside the boutique, the composed atmosphere had fractured. The woman in the gray blazer had put her phone fully up now and was recording without pretending not to. The 2 browsers near the fitting rooms had gravitated together instinctively. The junior associate had taken several steps back from the window with her hand pressed flat against her sternum. Vivian had turned toward the entrance, and for the first time since Elna had arrived, the managed certainty had left her face. The boutique's own security shutter began to lower outside the glass doors and then stopped. It stopped because 2 men were holding it. They had taken the descending steel in their hands and held it elevated, arms braced, faces empty of effort or expression, creating a doorway that was already closing on everything else but remained open for one person. The mall behind them had gone to a silence that was not natural. Not the silence of emptiness but the silence of many people who have simultaneously understood that something is happening that they do not have the vocabulary to process. Han Sung-ho walked through. He moved with a complete absence of urgency that is more frightening than any rush, because it communicates that the person moving has already accounted for everything in the room and found none of it requiring speed. His black 3-piece suit was immaculate. His open collar revealed the edge of ink at his throat. And his hands were at his sides, not in his pockets, not clasped, just there, available, the hands of someone who has not yet decided what they will need to do but wants them ready. His face was a study in controlled temperature. Cold in the way of something that is cold because it made a deliberate decision to be, not because it was never warm. He walked through the boutique entrance between his 2 men and the held shutter and stopped. He looked at Elna. For a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4. The boutique and everyone in it ceased to exist. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the botanical garden when she had said yes, with that particular quality of attention that was not about the room or the audience or the situation but entirely about her. He read everything. Her posture. Her hands. The set of her jaw. The calm she was maintaining and what it was costing her. He read it all in the space of those seconds and something passed across his expression. Brief, private, not for anyone else, and she understood without needing to say anything that he knew. Not just what had happened in this room in the last 20 minutes but the rest of it too. Then he exhaled through his nose, a single measured breath, and the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. He walked to her. He stopped when he was standing beside her, not in front of her, beside her the way you stand with someone, not over them, and he said very quietly just to her, "Are you all right?" She held his gaze. "I'm fine." "You're not," he said. Also quiet. Also just to her. Not a contradiction, an acknowledgement. The difference between those things was something only he would have known to make. She let out a breath she had been holding for longer than she realized. "No," she said. "I'm not." He nodded once. Then he turned. Vivian had not moved from her position near the scarf wall. This, Alna thought distantly, was either extraordinary composure or a failure to understand what had just entered the room. Looking at Vivian's face now, the maintained surface, the slight flare of the nostrils, the recalibration happening behind the eyes, she thought it was the latter. Vivian was a woman who understood status hierarchies, but she understood them in the language of the room she operated in. She understood labels and appointment lists and which clients had which accounts. She did not speak the language of what had just walked through her door. She was about to be given a very thorough translation. Sung-ho looked at her the way he looked at problems. Not with anger. Anger was loud and loud was inefficient. With attention. The full, flat, complete attention of someone who has identified a thing that requires addressing and is about to address it in the most economical way possible. "Your name," he said. It was not a question. Vivian straightened. "I'm the manager of this." "Your name," he said again. Same tone. Same volume. Just again. "Vivian Cho." "Miss Cho." He took one step toward her. Not aggressive. Just closing the conversational distance to a range that allowed no ambiguity about who was speaking and who was being spoken to. "You were given instructions this morning regarding a specific customer." It was not a question this time either. The way he said it made clear that he was not fishing for information but confirming what he already had. The color that moved through Vivian's face was not a blush. It was something colder. The particular pallor of someone who realizes they have been operating inside a story whose full dimensions they did not know. "I don't know what you mean," she said. Her voice had lost its polish. Not entirely but noticeably the way expensive paint chips when you hit it with something harder. "Mrs. Cha contacted you," Sung-ho said. "At 9:47 this morning. She described a woman who would arrive alone, unescorted, between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. She asked you to make the experience. What was the word she used?" He paused. Behind him, Park Jiseok, who had entered the boutique and positioned himself near the door, produced a phone and read from the screen in a level voice. "Thorough." "Thorough," Sung-ho repeated. He said it without expression, which made it worse. "She asked you to make the experience thorough." A woman near the fitting rooms made a small sound. The one who had been filming had lowered her phone, though she had not, Alna noticed, stopped recording. "Mrs. Cha is a client of this boutique," Vivian said, and she was trying to recover the certainty, trying to return to the register of procedural authority, but it was like watching someone attempt to pour water back into a glass after they'd knocked it over. "She has certain preferences regarding." "Mrs. Cha," Sung-ho said, "is the wife of a man who owes me 400 million won and has been attempting for the past 18 months to position himself favorably in my business relationships before that debt is collected." He said it the way you state a fact in a document. Calmly. Completely. "This afternoon was an attempt to humiliate my fiancé in public before she meets my family, in the hope that either I would lose confidence in her judgment, or she would lose confidence in her place beside me." He let that sit for a moment. Neither of those things happened. The boutique was entirely still. Alna was watching Vivian watch Sung-ho and thinking about the word fiancé in his mouth. The way he had said it, not as a revelation for the room but as a simple categorical fact. The way you state something that was always true and is now simply being acknowledged aloud. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Something closer to the feeling of being accurately seen. "I was following instructions from a client," Vivian said. Her voice was very careful now. "I wasn't told who she." You were told enough, Sung-ho said. You were told she would be alone. You were told to make it thorough. You chose the manner. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone reviewing arithmetic. A woman came into your store today to buy a gift for her future mother-in-law. She was quiet. She was polite. She was impeccably dressed. And you decided before she crossed your threshold that she wasn't worth serving. Another pause. The decision you made this afternoon will cost you this job. What Mrs. Cha asked you to do will cost her considerably more. He turned slightly toward Jiziak. Contact the building management office. I want the lease review for this unit on my desk by tomorrow morning. Jiziak made a note. Not ostentatiously. Just noted it. You can't, Vivian began. The building is managed through Haesol Properties, Sung-ho said. Haesol Properties is a subsidiary of Daekong Holdings. I have a 31% stake in Daekong Holdings. He said it without pride, without aggression, without any particular emphasis. Just information precisely delivered. I can. Vivian's composure broke then. Not dramatically, there were no tears, no raised voice. But the architecture of it simply stopped holding, the way a building looks the same for a moment after the supports have been removed and then does not. She looked suddenly, like a woman who had been holding something very heavy for a long time and had just been informed that she had been holding it in the wrong direction. Nobody in the room spoke. The woman in the gray blazer had definitely stopped recording now. The junior associate was looking at the floor. The shoppers who remained in the space had the particular frozen quality of people who have witnessed something they will be describing for years. Sung-ho came back to Elna's side. He did not touch her immediately. He stood beside her, and for a moment they were simply two people standing in the wreckage of someone else's careful plan, and the room gave them that moment, the way rooms sometimes do when the story they've been participating in has reached its pivot and they're waiting to see what comes next. There's a call I need to make, he said. Oh, just to her. She knew what call. Mrs. Cha, she said. Yes. She nodded. She thought about the engagement dinner. About the table full of people she had not yet met, the world she was about to formally enter, the particular species of enemy it appeared had already decided to treat her arrival as a threat to be neutralized. She thought about all of it and felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment. Clarity. I want to be in the room, she said. He looked at her. The particular quality of his attention when she surprised him, rare and precise. When you make the call, she said. I want to be there. Something that was not quite a smile moved at the edge of his mouth. All right. And I want to know everything she knew, Elna said. All of it. Not just the parts you think I need. Everything. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the mall remained sealed and silent. The shutters held their position. The men at the doors stood without moving, without impatience, like architecture. Yes, he said. And it was the same word she had said in the botanical garden, delivered the same way, simply, completely, without reservation. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked toward the door together, and the two men holding the shutter raised it smoothly as they approached, an unhurried, coordinated gesture, like something that had been rehearsed for exactly this exit. The boutique remained behind them. The marble floors and the crystal chandeliers, and Vivian in her crimson suit, standing very still beside the scarf wall, the teal silk she had relocated still hanging exactly where she had put it. No longer a boundary but a monument to a miscalculation. Elna did not look back. The call to Mrs. Cha happened in the back of Sung-ho's car, with the partition raised and the city moving past the tinted windows in the particular soft blur of late afternoon. Jiziak drove. The other vehicles in the convoy moved with the quiet efficiency of things that have always been there, that you might not notice until you understand what they are. Elna sat beside Sung-ho and listened. The call was brief. Mrs. Cha answered on the third ring with the voice of a woman who had been expecting this and had prepared herself, which was its own kind of answer. Sung-ho said three things. He said that he was aware of her instructions to the boutique. He said that the engagement dinner would proceed as planned and that Elna would be at the table. And he said finally, in the way of a man who has decided something permanent, the debt your husband owes me becomes due immediately. In full. Contact my office by 9 tomorrow morning. He ended the call. The city continued past the windows. Alma was quiet for a moment, processing. How long have you known about her? I've known about the debt for some time, he said. I didn't know she decided to use you as leverage until this afternoon. How did you find out I was at the boutique? One of the mall staff is on a security retainer I maintain. She sent a message when the shutters were called down. He looked out the window. I should have had someone with you. I asked you not to. I know. And I'm glad I went alone, Alma said. He looked at her. I know that sounds strange, but I needed to know who I was without your name in the room. I know who that is now. She paused. I'm not as afraid of it as I thought I might be. He was quiet for a moment, the quality of quiet that was his version of something being received. You were never the person I was worried about, he said finally. What do you mean? I mean that I spent a long time wondering whether the life I have would be too much for you. He said it without apology, just with the honesty of a man who had thought about something carefully and arrived at the place where saying it was simpler than holding it. I don't wonder that anymore. Alma looked at him. Because I survived a rude woman in a boutique? Because you stood in the middle of a room that had decided against you, he said, and you didn't move. You didn't adjust. You didn't look for the exit. He met her eyes. You were exactly yourself. In the worst version of that room. Pause. You're the least afraid person I know. She felt the truth of it settle into her. Not as flattery, he did not traffic in flattery, but as the kind of recognition that only means something when it comes from someone who has been paying close enough attention to know the difference between a person who appears to be without fear and a person who has simply chosen not to be governed by it. I was afraid, she said. Yes, he agreed. And you stood there anyway. The engagement dinner happened 2 days later as scheduled, in a private dining room that the family had been using for formal gatherings for more than 2 decades. The table was long and formal and set with the kind of precision that communicated history. Sung-ho's mother was smaller than Elna had imagined, with a straight back and the eyes of someone who had been making judgments about people for 70 years and had refined the process to something very fast and very final. She had looked at Elna when she arrived, looked at her properly, the full, unguarded assessment of a woman who did not pretend to be forming an impression she had already formed, and then she had extended both hands and held Elna's in hers and said, in English that was careful and deliberate, "My son told me what happened at the boutique." Elna had stilled. "He told me that you stood your ground," she continued, "alone, without calling him." She studied Elna's face for a moment. "He has never told me that about anyone." They held that between them for a moment. The two of them, the room, the particular weight of what had been said and what had been meant by it. "I brought you something," Elna said. She produced the handmade book of pressed botanicals she had found that afternoon, which felt like a very long time ago now, in the quiet stationery shop before everything had changed. She offered it with both hands. Sung-ho's mother took it and opened it slowly, examining the pages with the attention she gave everything, and then looked up at Elna with an expression that had softened into something warmer than assessment. "This required patience," she said. "Yes," Elna said. "I thought you might appreciate that." The old woman's mouth curved. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of someone who does not distribute them freely and therefore makes each one mean something. "Sit next to me," she said. Elna sat. 3 weeks after the engagement dinner, Maison Alera closed. The announcement, delivered through the building management office with a kind of bureaucratic neutrality that made the reason illegible to most observers, cited a lease review and a change in the building's operational designation for that unit. There was no statement from the boutique, no press release, no social media announcement. One day it was there and then it wasn't, and for most people it was simply one of those things that happen in commercial real estate. A turn of the market, a change in direction, the quiet reorganization of a retail space. Elna found out through Jiziak, who had made it his practice to brief her on things that were relevant to her life in the way that mattered, which was to say completely and without softening. He told her what Sung-ho had set in motion. The lease acquisition, the planning permissions, The partnership with a nonprofit that worked with young women from low-income backgrounds who wanted careers in the fashion and textile industry. Scholarship placements. Mentorship. A proper studio properly equipped. She had been sitting at the desk in their apartment working on an essay about light in cities, and she had read the brief on her phone and been quiet for a long time. Then she had typed a message to Sung-ho, who was in a meeting across the city. The space. What you're doing with it? His reply came 40 minutes later. It was yours to decide what to do with. I just acquired it. She read that twice. Then once more. She wrote, "You're going to make me say something embarrassing in a text message." He wrote back, "I know. Go ahead." She laughed, alone at the desk, the kind of laugh that starts somewhere behind the ribs and arrives unexpectedly, the kind that clears something. He typed, "I love you. That's the embarrassing thing." He replied immediately, which was not usually his way with messages. "I know. It's mutual." And then, because he was who he was, a second message arrived 10 seconds later. "I have to go back into this meeting. Stop distracting me." She was still smiling when she put the phone down and turned back to her essay about light in cities. Outside the apartment windows, the city moved in its ordinary afternoon rhythm. The noise of traffic and weather and a million people making their way through the world with varying degrees of grace. She had written about cities on 6 continents. She had described the specific quality of light in places most people never went and a handful of places everyone wanted to be. She was good at noticing the thing beneath the obvious thing, at finding the sentence that made a reader stop and feel briefly and completely that they were standing in a place they had never been. She thought about Vivian in her crimson suit with her raised hand and her managed expression and her certainty that she was the one who decided who belonged in beautiful rooms. She thought about the apprentices who would one day sit in the space that had been Maison Alara. Young women learning to cut and construct and create, learning the language of fabric the way her mother had learned it, by patient hours of attention, by the kind of knowledge that accumulates slowly and belongs to you completely when it arrives. She thought about standing in that room alone, her hands on her bag, her posture steady, the temperature dropping when the chandelier light shifted and the shutters descended and Han Sung-ho walked through a door as though the city had been rearranged specifically for that entrance. She thought about dignity, about what it meant to protect yours, about the difference between enduring something gracefully and deciding that graceful endurance was the only option available. She had spent a long time believing those were the same thing. They were not. She opened her notebook and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. Not for the essay, not for anything that would be published. Just for herself. The way her mother had taught her to mark the things worth keeping. The room belongs to the person who refuses to leave it. She underlined it once. Then she went back to the essay, and the afternoon held its light, and the city outside kept moving with its ordinary and inexhaustible noise. And somewhere across town, in a meeting room that was almost certainly arranged to convey the precise texture of his authority, Han Sung-ho was sitting at the head of a table and being, in the way he was always being, terrifyingly present. She found this, as she almost always did, both slightly alarming and deeply reassuring. She wrote for another 3 hours. The essay came out well. It said something true about what cities look like when you stop performing your presence in them and start actually inhabiting them. And her editor called the next morning to say it was some of the best work she'd done in years. Alma Mills thanked her, said goodbye, and walked to the kitchen to make tea, moving through the apartment with the ease of a woman who had decided, some time ago and without announcement, that every room she entered belonged to her. It was simply a matter of knowing it when she walked through the door.